Most of the knowledge you think you possess contains little to no value. In fact, a lot of knowledge does not even exist in reality. For example, countries do not exist at all in the real world. In the real world, planet Earth is just a giant ball filled with water and chunks of land sticking out of that water. you know, Before humans arrived on Earth, countries did not exist. And as soon as humans came along, they started to inhabit certain areas and they started to draw boundaries to make clear distinctions between different areas. And they also started to name these areas. But of course, these boundaries are created by humans. These boundaries exist in our brains. Planet Earth did not invent all the different countries for itself. No, we did. Countries are a human fantasy. They literally do not exist. So if you are that smart guy or girl who knows all the countries in the world, and if you can point all the countries on a map, well, I'm sorry, you haven't proved anything because you still know nothing about reality. I mean, what value does knowledge have when it actually is just a pure fantasy? You know? Okay, so what about Hitler? Do you know who Hitler was? Do you know about World War II? Do you know about the Holocaust? You really must know that. That's highly valuable knowledge. We should never forget about the Holocaust. Well, again, I'm sorry, but we have to understand what this knowledge means when we put it into a universal context. What does the Holocaust mean within within cosmic scales? So the Holocaust happened between 1940 and 1945, but of course, our human existence in comparison with the universe almost means nothing. The amount of time that humanity will exist in the universe means nothing to the infinity of the universe itself. So the entirety of World War II will completely vanish as billions and billions of years will pass by. So this whole notion of let's never forget World War II is kind of stupid because of course it will be forgotten. It will be totally forgotten as if it never happened. Simply everything within the limited existence of humanity in the universe will be completely forgotten. All of our knowledge will be gone. I mean, you may think that you are smart because, for example, you have a lot of knowledge about different cultures in the world, but what is the value of that knowledge when it is finite? All that knowledge will come to an end. It will exist for a while in the universe and then it will probably vanish forever. So, you know what I'm trying to say? Pretty much all of our knowledge is temporary. It will eventually vanish. So I just wonder what the value of that knowledge is when it will eventually turn into total non existence forever. Whereas real knowledge should be infinite, unbreakable, immortal, everlasting. Because only then can we speak of foundational knowledge, universal knowledge, knowledge which is infinitely solid and which does not cease to exist. That's real knowledge because real knowledge is as infinite as the universe itself. So real knowledge perfectly aligns with the universe. If you possess real knowledge, you possess the universe, basically. And the closest that we can get to infinite knowledge is through understanding the basic principles of how everything works. For example, the mathematical principle of calculating the circumference of a circle is most likely a universal principle, which means that this principle is useful for eternity. Whether we calculate the circumference of a circle right now or we calculate it 5 billion years from now, we will most likely still be able to use the exact same mathematical principle. So the value of this principle is infinite. I mean, the way the universe has been creating galaxies, stars, and planets is clearly based on the same principle over and over again. There is some underlying mechanism on which the entire functioning of the universe is based on. And if you possess that knowledge, then you basically possess the entirety of everything that the universe ever was and ever will be. You possess the infinity of the universe all at once. And this is the most powerful and the most valuable knowledge you can ever attain. So, what is that universal knowledge? Is it mathematics? Well, our human mathematical system is based on symbols, and the way we represent our symbols is not universal. For example, if we look at the second law of Newton, we use symbols such as F, which means force. But the concept force is a concept which refers to something in reality. The concept force does not refer to itself because the word force is just a word, and it doesn't represent itself as just being a word. It represents something outside of itself in reality. Simply said, it doesn't really matter what is being used to represent the concept of force. It could be a word, it could be a sound, it could be an object. I mean, the way we represent force is most likely different than the way it is represented by, for example, extraterrestrial beings. You know, the way we as humans represent mathematics is most likely different than the way extraterrestrials would represent mathematics. We will use different symbols and different equations than extraterrestrials would. But eventually it would represent the same thing in reality. We can compare this with ordinary language. The English language is different from Russian language, and even though the English word for chair is different from the Russian word for chair, they represent the same thing in reality. Get it? And so, the language or the symbols that we use to represent things in reality don't matter. Whether it be French, Russian, Chinese, Spanish, or non-verbal language, or whatever form of communication, it doesn't matter. It will eventually point to the same thing in reality. So my point is that since pretty much anything could be used to represent something in reality, the thing itself, which we want to represent with whatever form of communication, is essentially communication free. So, in reality, the most correct way to describe a thing in a universal and infinite way is through the absence of description. And my second point is that all the forms of communication that are used to represent the infinite principles of the way reality works are temporary. So temporary language or communication that wants to represent infinite principles. So here is a brief overview of what I'm trying to point out. 1. All forms of language or communication are temporary because they are unique to civilizations which only exist for a temporary amount of time somewhere in the universe. 2. The point of communication is to represent temporary experiences being experienced by a temporary civilization. 3. Also, the point of communication is to represent infinite/universal principles, but since all forms of communication are temporary, and since the universal principles are infinite, we cannot ascribe one specific form of communication to the universal principles. So ultimately, the universal principles remains free from communication. And 4, conclusion, the highest valuable knowledge possible is the knowledge that you can possess through the absence of trying to communicate that knowledge. So it is utterly impossible to communicate this knowledge, yet it is the most valuable knowledge of existence. And once you possess this knowledge, you possess the entire universe, because this knowledge is totally universal. This knowledge contains the very reason why everything in reality is the way it is. But if you try to communicate it, you will lose the value of it, because the form of communication itself that you want to use to communicate this infinite valuable knowledge is temporary. So do not focus on the communication itself, but recognize that all communication is pointing to or referring to something which is totally free from communication. And that's it. Real infinite knowledge is free from communication. You cannot translate it into interpretable language. All language, all communication just revolves around this thing which is fundamentally free from communication. Thanks for listening.